All right, so let's look at How by Allen Ginsberg. In my opinion, one of the greatest, well, modern, obviously it's postmodern, but modern American poems of all time. It pulls from traditions of Whitman, right, with his use of free verse and lists. And the first thing that you'll notice in part one, section one of this poem, is that it is essentially just a list for 4 pages. Um, so I will say to you, pay attention to what he's listing. What Ginsberg is doing in part one of this poem is discussing, in a very Whitman-esque sense, what he believes to be quintessentially American at this moment for him in the mid to late 50s. So, as I said in the postmodern kind of Ginsberg video, um, it's about counterculture, right? So we're at, obviously after World War II, and we're into the 50s. We have the Beat Generation. People are incredibly disillusioned, right? And as you know, we'll get into the 60s, and then that is the explosion of the hippie counterculture and Vietnam. Vietnam is obviously after this poem, but we can see these sentiments starting to kind of roil and boil up, right? Um, People are unhappy, right? And in the vein of Whitman, what Ginsberg is doing here is very much so what Langston Hughes did in I Too, right? Hughes points out as a direct response to Whitman that sure, but you left out black people, right? So what Ginsberg is doing here is saying sure, but you know you've left out fringe individuals, right? Which is interesting considering how much Whitman was obsessed with kind of being an outlier, right? Like in our first Whitman video with that image of him on Leaves of Grass, right? He's supposed to kind of look like a New York tough, right? So he's supposed to be on the outlying fringes of society, but that's changed so much over 50 years, 60 years. And we have Ginsberg now carrying on that torch. In sentiment, but also in style. Like all of Whitman's work, HOWL is in free verse. It's long. There are very long lines of free verse, and also in a Whitman-esque style. Part one is all just a list, right? So what you're supposed to gather from this list is what Ginsberg is saying truly is American, right? Um, Under, you know, the people that are like Whitman on the fringe of society, people that are outliers, people that are dejected. Um, he's much more blatantly pointing out that section of America, right? And obviously in much more obscene and blunt ways. And it's important to note before we even get into this piece that on October 3rd, 1957, HOWL was judged to be not an obscene piece of literature. So Ginsberg had to go up against the courts on obscenity charges, right? I mean, think about it. It's, 57. He's talking about drugs. He's talking about queer relations. He's talking about a rejection of, the traditional concept of what it means to be like a perfect American citizen. And there's a lot of argument behind this case that, yes, I mean, you'll read it. Hopefully you've read it already or listened to Ginsburg reading it in the video I posted. But I mean, there's, you know, nothing in any way that would be shocking to us now, but, 70 odd years ago definitely offended people. And, he had to go up and testify and essentially argue his First Amendment rights to be an artist and to be creative, which he won. Even though Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who published the book, was arrested for selling it, Ginsburg got off the obscenity charges. So, HOWL is an elaborate and quasi-apocalyptic vision of an America on the verge of collapse, right? In particular, our speaker, which we can't say is Ginsburg, but we could argue is lamenting how mainstream culture has curtailed or stifled the fundamental spirit of freedom and creativity in the United States, right? So his argument in the poem and at his case was that, we evolve as people, right? Um, what is considered creative and what is considered acceptable changes as time changes and as culture changes and as people change. Um, and he was kind of on the forefront of that in a lot of ways. And he won it, which is phenomenal. But as I said, part one is all a massive list. And I'm not going to read this entire poem to you. You should listen to Ginsburg reading it. But I will point out highlights and discuss themes. Part one is much longer than part two and part three. And that can be a little daunting, right? Because part one, I think, is like 4 pages long. And it is just a list. It is a list, though, of who Ginsburg is saying are these left out denizens of our country, right? Very much so what Hughes was doing in I too. So there are 5 major themes throughout the poem, and the first 3 are addressed in part 1. Now, before we get into those, we do need to talk about the fact that this is dedicated to Carl Solomon, right? So Carl Solomon, as our note tells us, Ginsburg and Solomon met while they were both patients in a psychiatric institute, right? Ginsburg has called Solomon an intuitive Bronx Dadaist and prose poet. We have not gotten into prose poetry yet, or really discussed Dadaism because there's not really a lot of it in the anthology, but Dadaism is kind of anti-art. It is a German movement that happened during World War I, and it had less to do with writing and more to do with visual arts, painting, dance, etc. Prose poetry is exactly what it sounds like. We'll look at some of that later this semester, but it's, if you define a poem as something that has line breaks and meter and rhythm, a prose poem is essentially written as prose, right? So it doesn't have those ideas in there. But before we jump into what I consider to be some of the more important descriptions, some of them are the main descriptions that were brought up during Ginsburg's obscenity trial. Some of them I just think are important. But we have our first 3 themes, right? So we have madness, which is very relative in HOWL, right? Because you have to consider What does it mean to be mad? What does it mean to be insane, right? Ginsburg is arguing this point by saying that even though he has been institutionalized, that he is sane, right? Um, and that maybe it's everyone else that is not. And we'll discuss that more as the poem goes on. But madness and how is relative, right? So um, the purpose of the concept of madness in this piece is to turn our readers, us the readers, common notions of sanity on its head, right? So people that society typically see as perfectly normal, our speaker considers insane. People that society generally see as mentally ill, the speaker considers misunderstood, if not misunderstood geniuses, which, is a sentiment that we can still consider today. Ginsburg spent 8 months in the Columbia Presbyterian Psychiatric Hospital, where he met Carl Solomon, to whom the poem is dedicated. He thought Solomon was a talented artist whose gifts were stifled by the oppressive psychiatric treatment he received, shock treatment. The poem treats hospitals and doctors with suspicion, while visions and hallucinations, are signs of divine connection. Um, One of the most memorable experiences of Ginsburg's life was a vision in which William Blake, the visionary um, industrialist, English kind of post romantic poet, um, recited his poetry to Ginsburg. However, the line between inspired madness, genuine madness, and drug induced madness is very blurry in this poem. So the question is, how do you define someone as being mad, right, or mentally ill? And Ginsburg, in a lot of ways, most ways, disagrees with, um, you know, the actual definition of insanity. Our second theme, which is rampant in part one, is going to be visions of America, right? This is a very Whitman-esque concept. Many writers have explored America. They have focused on what most renowned and respectable people do, right? And assume that it represents the country as a whole. Think back to realism, right? Which is focusing on not the upper class, but kind of a comfortable middle class. Then we have naturalism, which is focusing on kind of a fringe lower class, very much so like Ginsburg is doing here. But it's the assumption, and that we should assume that it represents the country as a whole. Ginsburg works from the opposite direction here, right? So from the bottom up, his best minds are people who fall asleep drunk on the subway and travel across the country in stolen cars. Um, People falling asleep intoxicated and having interesting dreams. That goes all the way back to Stephen's disillusionment of 10 o'clock, right? Who has the best dreams? Not the boring people in the world that wear the same white nightgowns. It's drunk sailors dreaming of tigers, right? Um, and this is because, in Ginsburg's view, America has been flipped upside down, right? Democracy and the common man have taken a back seat to profit, to politicians, and to the police, which comes more into play in section 2, the Moloch section. This perspective can sometimes seem very narrow and limited, but it's important to remember that Ginsburg witnessed a broader slice of America by the age of 29 than most any of us ever will in our entire lives, right? By the time he was 29, he had traveled across the entire country, um, extensively, meeting, every type of person possible, having every possible experience that he could experience. So, um, he is really set in the counterculture, and HOWL is a chronicle of a wide range of American experiences that most Americans will never experience, and honestly probably don't want to experience, right? But we have Ginsberg here putting it out in the world for us. And our third theme, which not only runs through section 1, but through all 3, is religion, right? Now, after this, Ginsberg is a spiritualist, but he was raised Jewish, and a Kaddish is kind of the death rite um, in the in Judaism. And one of his other long, most famous poems is called a Kaddish, and he wrote it when his mother died. Um, so there is a question if Ginsberg is actually a religious poet. We could argue he's not here, and maybe so later he leans more into that. Or is he a spiritual poet, right? One which is a word we sometimes use to describe people who seem to believe in something, but we're not really sure what that is, right? After all, the speaker of HOWL seems to cherry pick names and symbols from many religious traditions, from Kabbalah to Islam to Christianity to Buddhism, plus many lines in the poem would be considered hearsay by Orthodox religions. Um, you know, such as when the speaker suggests that we don't need the idea of a supernatural Jesus, but we need a literal Jesus, right? Obviously, a sacrilegious comment to a Christian. Specifically, he can be considered a mystic, right? Which I kind of brought up in our Ginsberg PowerPoint with him going on live TV and doing the Hare Krishna, right? Which is a mystic tradition, which means he's not interested in patiently following the rules and dogmas set down by traditional religious sects and texts, right? He wants communion with God or a higher power. Um, and again, other notable mystic poets, William Blake, as we discussed a few minutes ago, and Dante Alighieri, who wrote, well, the Inferno is his most famous piece, but the Divine Comedy in the 15th century, the Divina Commedia, right? So, if we're thinking about visions of America and madness throughout this poem, and we'll see some religion, right? Again, this is all just a list. So we see, most importantly, I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, right? It's one of the most famous opening lines of an American piece of literature we have, regardless of it being a poem. Um, and that's where you should really springboard off of as a reader, right? I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness. So the question that you should ask yourself is, why are these the best minds of our speaker's generation? And what madness has destroyed them, right? So we move on. Starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix, right? So obviously, right off the bat, we have a drug reference. Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection. Um, connection, you could take that as a fix, right? Um, Someone looking for drugs, or, right, you need to think about double meanings in a lot of this piece. Or are they looking for enlightenment in one way or another? Um, what does it mean to be searching for enlightenment, and how do you get there, right? Hollow-eyed, hollow-eyed and high sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats, floating across the tops of cities, contemplating jazz. We have tenement roofs. Um, so, imagery wise, right? This is very different from what Whitman has talked about, right? This is how Ginsberg has chosen to glorify the best generations, the best minds of his generation, right? And it's not what we would think of right off the bat, right? Um, who passed through universities with radiant, cool eyes, hallucinating Arkansas and Blake light. Blake, another reference to William Blake, who were expelled from the academies for crazy and publishing obscene odes on the windows of the skull, who cowered in unshaven rooms in underwear, burning their money in wastebaskets and listening to the terror through the walls, right? Um, so again, Ginsberg is heralding and championing people that have been kicked out of college, right? Um, as he was from Columbia, right? Um, so he's arguing that, you know, learn what you need to learn, and if you think you got to get out, get out. A sentiment that is harder to apply today, but back in the 50s, uh, the percentage of people that go to college now is vastly greater than 70-ish years ago. Um, but it also does kind of point out, which he never brings up in this poem, um, he is privileged, right? He grew up in a wealthy suburb. He went to Columbia, which then and now is still, considered one of the best schools in the country. And sure, he got kicked out, but he did get that education and he didn't pay for it. So you can point out his hypocrisies, even though he did embed himself deeply and for the rest of his life into this counterculture. But, people with a belt of marijuana, right, who drank turpentine in Paradise Alley, which is a not around anymore, but an old alley in the East Village in New York, which was, known for being a center of counterculture and drug use, with dreams, with drugs, with waking nightmares, alcohol and cock and endless balls. So, we can see pretty early on why in 1957 he would have been pulled up on obscenity charges, right? Um, But aside from points like that, we also have illuminating all the motionless world of time between. Through a lot of section one of this poem, Ginsberg, yes, is concerned with, um, who the best minds of his generation actually were, but there are a lot of questions about time, right? And what it means to kind of exist in time, right? Obviously, his time in the mid to late 50s while he was writing this. But what does it mean to be between time, right? Um, it's a very postmodern idea, right? We're post World War II, and unbeknownst to Ginsberg, we were between another war, right? We'll be in Vietnam soon. So if Ginsberg is questioning what it means to be an American and what makes America important, it's not blatantly laid out in this poem at all, even though it is brought up a little bit in the Moloch section 2, but he's arguing that, like, and, we can look at it from an economic standpoint, but there's always a boom after a war, right? He's kind of keen to this idea. who talk countlessly 70 hours from park to pad to bar to Bellevue. Bellevue is another institution in New York City, to museum, to Brooklyn Bridge. Yakety yakketing, screaming, vomiting, whispering facts. Yakety yakketing, a great example of onomatopoeia, right? We'll see in a couple lines down um, a very interesting version of onomatopoeia, which scholars and poets consider to be one of the most fun word plays of the definition of onomatopoeia that we kind of have in modern literature. Um, but before we get to that, we obviously have this increasing repetition of who at the beginning of each line, right? An example of anaphora. But this is that onomatopoeia, right? Who lit cigarettes in boxcars, 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 racketing through snow toward lonesome farms and grandfather night. Um, it's that boxcars, 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 which has been considered one of the greatest modern versions of onomatopoeia out there, right? Because we think of onomatopoeia as a word that describes a sound. Yakety yakketing, a boom, bam, slam, pow, right? Whatever. What Ginsberg is doing here, and why he's so heralded for this repetition of three words, is that you read boxcars and it's supposed to create the sound of a rolling train, right? Like boxcars, boxcars, boxcars. If you've ever been by a train passing before, which I'm sure you all have, it's that like da-dum, da-dum, da-dum sound, right? And this is supposed to emulate that. Who studied telepathy and Bob Kabbalah, right? This is a great example, a mystical tradition of interpreting Hebrew scripture, bop, right? Jazz bop, a style of jazz in the 1940s. So if he's aligning a mystical tradition of Judaism with bop jazz, you know, some people are going to consider that sacrilegious. And we move, right? We leave New York City, we're in Oklahoma, we're in Houston, where people are seeking jazz or sex or soup, which is just an absurd list of things to be looking for. Well, music, physical connection, food, sure. Um, Sex or soup, example of alliteration, and we move on. Um, Ginsberg really likes to connect, vulgar or obscene ideas with religious ones, which is a large part of why he was brought up on obscenity charges, who let themselves be fucked in the ass by saintly motorcyclists and screamed with joy, who blew and were blown by those human seraphim, right? Seraphim being the highest level of angel. So, he's equating sexual ecstasy with a religious order, um, right? So it makes more and more sense why he was brought up on obscenity charges in 1957. Um, but then we move, right? There's physical movement in this poem. Now we're in Colorado. We're back to Manhattan. And we just keep moving on and on. Um, Keep this in mind. I love this line, and it will come up in your reading response. But who ate the lamb stew of the imagination? Ginsberg fills this poem, especially part one, with these wild metaphors and connections, um, which you can read and be like, what the hell's that? Or you can read and be like, that's funny, or maybe it connects with you. But what is the lamb stew of imagination, right? Why would Ginsberg connect hearty stew with the imagination, right? What's the importance there? Um, and again, we have this discussion of time. Who threw their watches off the roof to cast their ballot for eternity outside of time? We have this idea of being within this fringe societal group of American citizens, right? What's the point of time? What's the point of being on a schedule, right? What's the point of a 9 to 5 job where you're unhappy all the time? And alarm clocks fell on their heads every day for the next decade. We move on to Denver, right? We have another kind of obscene religious connection here. Another drug reference. Uh, you know, not to say that it's not repetitive in ideas, which Whitman is as well, but it's also the idea that, this kind of vomit list of people and places and occurrences just all build on top of each other, right? Um, and even though ideas are repetitive, everything's kind of adding up to something. Um, and then he throws in, who in humorless protest overturned only one symbolic ping pong table, which is an allusion to Jesus overturning the money changers' tables in the Bible. Um, which there's another Jesus line in part one, which also was brought up in his obscenity charges, right? It's the idea that you don't need a spiritual Jesus, you just need a prophet, right? Um, then we have our first mention of Rockland, right? Which obviously comes into major play in part three because that's where Ginsberg and Carl Solomon were institutionalized. And now, finally, he addresses Carl Solomon. Ah, Carl, while you are not safe, I am not safe. And now you're really in the total animal soup of time. So here we start to see Ginsberg bringing people together, right? What is the connection between these 4 pages of description? Well, Ginsberg thinks that all of these people are connected in one way or another. Well, why? Because they're all kind of on the fringe of society, but also because he believes them to be sane, right? Um, then we move to section 2. Totally changes, um, and it has to do with Moloch, right? And if you don't know what Moloch is, this won't make sense. Even though he's taking this the original concept of Moloch in Judaism and, making it mean something that works for the peace. But traditionally, Moloch was a false god or idol to whom ancient Middle Eastern cultures sacrificed children by throwing them in a fire, which he then ate. Right? So basically, the speaker believes that modern American society gobbles up young people, makes them go mad, leaves them with nothing, um, and rather than bury yourself in books about ancient religions, you should let the speaker define what Moloch means to him, right? So here, Ginsberg is looking at us and readers, and though he's very clearly laying out what Moloch means to him, um, that can waver, right? That can mean something else to you as a reader. Um, among a lot of things, Moloch to Ginsburg represents solitude as in isolation, filth, ugliness, and everything else that is sad about the United States, right? To him, Moloch is the evil of industrialism and war, right? It's the evil of progress. It's also the evil of not doing anything to counter that, right? It's about being complacent, um, and how this kind of uniform existence destroys creativity, which leads into our fourth theme, which is rules and order, right? Um, no literary group at the time defied the rules that defined orderly life in 1950s America quite like the Beats, or the Hells Angels, who were kind of starting to be created at the time, but really came into uh, themselves in the late 50s, early 60s, the Motorcycle Gang, um, which also came from disillusioned World War II soldiers, uh, mostly fighter pilots. Um, but Ginsburg wasn't an anarchist. He believed that the severity of the justice and health systems stunted creativity of the nation's most promising individuals. We have to take him at his word at this, right? When he refers to all of the poem's rebels as the best minds of my generation, right? You could read through part one and completely disagree with him, right? But this is from our speaker's perspective, so, if you have to suspend your disbelief and try to settle into their mind. So the question is, what could have caused them to go so awry, right? And what HOWL does is it praises people who stage political protest, who smuggle drugs, who engage in anonymous public sex acts, jump off bridges, and plot revolutions, right? So if we're thinking about the fringe of society, these are the people that Ginsburg is praising. So, if if you don't agree with him, try to, right? Or at least try to see where he's coming from, and why he might feel that way, considering, what's happened to him, what's happened to his friends, what he sees um, as, his generation being stripped of their creativity and their freedom, right? What does it mean to be free in America? Um, it's obviously a question that gets argued every day now, and Ginsburg argued it again, 70 years ago. But Moloch is an incomprehensible prison. It's the jailhouse. It's Congress. Moloch, whose mind is pure machinery. Moloch, whose blood is running money. Moloch, whose fingers are 10 armies. Right? So to Ginsburg, Moloch is destruction. It's the destruction of life. It's the destruction of the natural world. It's the destruction of creativity. It's the destruction of freedom. It's caring more about stuff and money more than living and experiencing, right? It's falling in line and being sedentary as opposed to following your own path, whatever wild way that may take you. Moloch, whose love is endless oil and stone. And then section 2 ends with visions, omens, hallucinations, miracles, ecstasies gone down the American River, right? Kind of negative. Dreams, adorations, illuminations, religions, the whole boatload of sensitive bullshit breakthroughs over the river, flips and crucifixions gone down the flood, highs, epiphanies, despairs, 10 years, animals, screams, and suicides, minds, new loves, mad generation, down on the rock of time, right? So Ginsberg, again, you know, this very Whitman-esque style and tradition of listing things that are supposed to kind of pile up on each other so that we see the thing that comes before it a little differently after reading what follows it, right? Um, Real holy laughter in the river. We have this repetition of river here, right? First, it's the American river. And then our breakthroughs are coming over the river, and real holy laughter in the river. They saw it all, the wild eyes, the holy yells, the bade farewell. They jumped off the roof to solitude, waving, carrying flowers, down to the river, into the street, right? So what Ginsberg is saying is, again, very Whitman-esque. Whitman, who likes to look at city life and look at country life and find where they connect, right? Here we have Ginsberg discussing a river, right? Something that is always flowing and moving and changing, and he equates it to a city street, which one could argue in one way or another is always flowing and changing as well. Um, And then we find ourselves at section 3, right? The shortest section, and its major theme brought up is freedom and confinement. So, like other classics of beat literature, such as Jack Kerouac's On the Road, HOWL celebrates personal freedom and breaking free from social norms. Travel is one means of acquiring freedom, right? Think about section 1. We start in New York, go across the whole country, go to Mexico, go back into the United States, end up back in New York. That's essentially the track of Kerouac's novel On the Road. Um, so travel in one means is a way of acquiring freedom, right? The characters in HOWL do just as much globe trotting or country trotting and cross country road tripping as Kerouac's Dean Moriarty and Sal Paradise, the two main characters in that novel. The second and third sections, particularly part 3 that we're looking at now, deal with confinement, right? In section 2, Moloch is the god of prison, government, boring suburbia, oppression, while Rockland, right, remember the institution that Ginsberg and Carl Solomon were in, represents the mental and physical confinement of mental institutions, right? Um, and again, this repetition, right, this anaphora at the beginning of each line. Carl Solomon, I'm with you in Rockland, where you're madder than I am. I'm with you in Rockland, where you must feel very strange. I'm with you in Rockland, where you imitate the shade of my mother. I'm with you in Rockland, and on and on. So, this repetition of I'm with you in Rockland is meant, obviously, when Ginsberg wrote this, he was no longer institutionalized, and Carl Solomon was, at least for a little bit. So we have Ginsberg trying to be there for his friend, right? To say that I'm with you, right? Us, these people on the fringe of society, we're not alone because we have each other, right? I'm with you in Rockland, where 50 more shocks will never return your soul to its body again from its pilgrimage to a cross in the void. Obviously, electroshock therapy was a great way to cure problems in the 50s. I'm with you in Rockland, where we hug and kiss the United States under our bed sheets, the United States that coughs all night and won't let us sleep. Again, this line is pointing out the fact that Ginsburg feels like the other, right? He's not really aligned with what people believe he should be as an American, right? But I mean, what does it mean to be American if not to be an individualist, right? Look at Whitman. Um, I know this isn't American Lit 1, but I mean, look at the Transcendentalists, right? Emerson and Thoreau. This is all work about individualism and forging one's path in one way or another, regardless if people agree with you, right? I mean, it's an American sentiment that has been around since and before our country started. It's just evolved as the country has evolved, but also just as we've evolved as a human global society, right? If you look at all the colonists and their leaders, the reason that there were 13 colonies is because they couldn't agree on anything, right? Um, and people, would find themselves getting ejected from colony after colony. Um, like Roger Williams, who founded Rhode Island, right? Um, a priest who had some wild ideas and, was more in line with the fact that we had taken land from Native Americans. So he got ejected from a handful of New England colonies, ran out into the middle of the woods during winter because he knew he was going to get assassinated and or at least imprisoned, and was taken in by a native tribe, and then petitioned enough that he could get a little bit of land to start Rhode Island. And originally Rhode Island was supposed to be a colony um, where colonists and Native Americans could coexist together. Roger Williams didn't believe that we should name anything in the United States because everything already had names, because there are already people here, right? We've disagreed with each other since we've thought about starting a country, right? So, it makes sense that we have Ginsburg here in the late 50s, post World War II, on the cusp of a counterculture explosion in the 60s, um, feeling the other, feeling different, you know, not feeling like he belongs, but understanding that that's fine and that he can find his own place to belong. It's a quintessentially American poem, right? Very much so in the vein of any piece by Whitman or Emily Dickinson or Jack London or anything else that we've read this semester. Um, but I think it's the best piece for us to look at when kind of getting kicked into postmodernism, right? This is where things conceptually are more relatable, right? I don't know. I feel like post World War II up until now, um, what people and especially artists consider to be American or individualistic is more aligned with what we as modern Americans consider to be so. So there's a lot to think about in this piece. I would say again to you, section one, look at the lists, see how they kind of snowball on top of each other and what that means. How does Ginsburg juxtapose vulgarities with sacred imagery, right? He's not necessarily doing it just to piss people off. He has a point that he's trying to make. How can you define what is an America um, when we're all so vastly different, right? So, um, I will have your reading response posted tomorrow. Um, if If you have not taken it yet, good luck with your midterms. And like I said, I will have those graded as soon as possible. And yeah, have a good week.